When historians describe the events of 1812, they focus on Napoleon's march into Russia, the failed invasion, the retreat through winter. What they don't mention is what was happening in the lands Napoleon never reached, the territories that maps from 50 years earlier had labeled as Tartary, the regions that had suddenly mysteriously begun disappearing from official records just as European armies started their eastward campaigns. I wasn't looking for evidence of coordinated destruction when I started researching the fires of 1812. I was trying to understand why so many major cities across the world experienced catastrophic burning in the same narrow window of time. Moscow, certainly. Everyone knows about Moscow. But also Detroit, Washington, D.C., large portions of London, sections of St. Petersburg, and dozens of smaller cities across what we now call Russia, but what older maps had labeled as Tartarian territories. The official explanation presents each fire as isolated. Individual disasters, war, accident, natural causes, random coincidences clustering in a single year. But the pattern becomes impossible to ignore when you map the timing, the locations, the systematic nature of what burned and what remained standing. In Moscow, Napoleon's forces are blamed for the destruction, except Napoleon himself documented his shock at finding the city already burning when his armies arrived. His letters describe entering a city that was being deliberately destroyed by its own inhabitants, as if they were following orders from somewhere else. Russian historical accounts claim the fires were set to deny resources to the invading French. But that explanation requires us to believe that Russian citizens systematically burned their own homes, their own businesses, their own cultural heritage, rather than simply evacuating with portable valuables. What if the Moscow fires weren't Russian resistance to Napoleon? What if they were part of something larger? What if 1812 marked the final coordinated erasure of whatever remained of Tartarian civilization? Detroit burned in 1805, just 7 years before the larger pattern emerged. The entire settlement, gone in a matter of hours. Official cause, accidental fire in a bakery. But witnesses described the flames spreading with impossible speed, consuming buildings that should have been separated by enough distance to prevent such rapid progression. And in the aftermath, Detroit was rebuilt according to entirely new architectural plans. Plans that bore no resemblance to the original settlement layout. Washington, D.C. burned in 1814, 2 years after the global cluster. British forces are credited with the destruction, retribution for American attacks on Canadian territories. Except British officers documented finding many government buildings already damaged before their arrival, as if someone had been systematically clearing structures in preparation for complete demolition. London experienced major fires throughout 1811 and 1812. Separate incidents, we're told. Warehouse fires, dock fires, manufacturing district fires, but when you map the locations, they cluster around the Thames in areas that older city plans had shown entirely different architectural styles. Areas that after the fires were rebuilt according to the neoclassical uniformity that characterizes official London architecture today. The deeper I looked into the global pattern of 1812 fires, the more I realized they shared characteristics that random disasters shouldn't share. The timing was too coordinated, the destruction was too selective, and the rebuilding that followed was too uniform across cultures and continents that supposedly had no communication or coordination. What disturbs me most isn't the evidence of widespread destruction. It is the speed of reconstruction that followed. Cities that had taken decades or centuries to develop were rebuilt within a handful of years. Detroit, Washington, sections of Moscow, all rose from their ashes with remarkable speed, featuring architectural styles that bore little resemblance to what had been there before. How do you rebuild entire urban areas so quickly, without pre-existing plans, without established supply chains, without teams of trained architects and construction workers already in place? The official explanation presents this rapid reconstruction as testament to human resilience and determination. But that explanation requires us to ignore the logistical impossibilities of what was accomplished. Detroit is post. Fire reconstruction followed a radial street pattern designed by Judge Augustus Woodward, except Woodward had no training in urban planning, no background in architecture, no obvious source for the sophisticated mathematical principles that governed his design. Yet within months of the fire, he produced detailed plans for a city layout that incorporated advanced geometric principles and harmonious proportional relationships. Where did that knowledge come from? Why did similar mathematical principles appear in the reconstruction of other burned cities across different continents? Why do post-1812 urban renewal projects share structural similarities, despite supposedly being designed by different architects working independently? What if fires of 1812 weren't destroying cities? What if they were clearing sites for new construction? What if the rapid reconstruction wasn't miraculous recovery, but implementation of plans that had been prepared well in advance? And what if those plans were designed to replace Tartarian architecture with something else, something uniform, something controlled? The architectural evidence supports this possibility. Pre-1812 city plans show organic growth patterns, irregular street layouts, building styles that varied by local tradition and available materials. Post-1812 reconstruction consistently features geometric precision, mathematical relationships between structures, and architectural elements that appear across cultures with suspicious uniformity. In Moscow, the post-fire reconstruction introduced neoclassical elements that had no precedent in traditional Russian architecture. In Detroit, the radial street pattern contradicted every principle of frontier town development. In London, the rebuilt districts followed proportional systems that matched contemporary construction in St. Petersburg and Vienna. Despite supposedly being designed independently, the coordination problem becomes impossible to ignore. How did architects across different empires supposedly working without communication independently develop such similar approaches to urban reconstruction? How did they all simultaneously gain access to the advanced mathematical and engineering knowledge their designs required? How did they all coordinate their efforts to complete massive construction projects within the same narrow time frame? The 1812 fires weren't random disasters. They were a coordinated clearing operation. And what they cleared wasn't just buildings, but evidence of whatever civilization had been there before. Throughout the research, I kept finding references to unusual atmospheric phenomena accompanying the 1812 fires. Witnesses described smoke that behaved strangely, fires that burned with colors and intensities that didn't match normal combustion, and atmospheric disturbances that persisted long after the flames were extinguished. In Moscow, observers noted that the smoke had a metallic quality, reflected light in ways that seemed unnatural, and created atmospheric effects visible from hundreds of miles away. In Detroit, witnesses described fires that burned too hot, consumed stone and metal along with wood, and left behind ash with unusual properties that farmers noticed when they tried to plant in the cleared areas. These aren't normal characteristics of accidental fires or even deliberate burning using conventional methods. They suggest combustion enhanced by chemical agents, by materials that wouldn't have been available to primitive fire-setting techniques. They suggest technology being used to ensure complete destruction, to clear sites thoroughly for whatever was planned to replace them. What technology could have created these effects in 1812? The official timeline of scientific development doesn't include incendiary agents capable of producing the phenomena witnesses described. Unless that technology already existed, held by whoever was orchestrating the clearing operation. Unless the rapid reconstruction that followed wasn't miraculous recovery, but implementation of plans by people who possessed advanced engineering knowledge and had been preparing for this transformation for years. The global scope of the 1812 fires raises questions that conventional history never addresses. How do you coordinate simultaneous operations across multiple continents without modern communication? How do you mobilize the resources for massive reconstruction projects across different empires during a period of active warfare? How do you implement architectural plans requiring advanced mathematical knowledge in frontier settlements and established cities simultaneously? The logistics alone suggest an organization operating beyond the scope of any officially recognized government or institution. An organization with resources that transcended national boundaries, with knowledge that exceeded acknowledged technological capabilities, with coordination abilities that shouldn't have existed in 1812. What if the official narrative of 1812 as a year of random disasters followed by remarkable human resilience is covering for something much more systematic? What if the fires marked the final phase of a planned transformation, the last step in replacing one civilization with another? And what if the rapid reconstruction that followed wasn't miraculous recovery, but the installation of a new system by the same organization that had orchestrated the destruction? The evidence suggests that whatever Tartary actually was, it didn't simply fade from maps through natural political evolution. It was systematically erased, physically removed, architecturally replaced. The fires of 1812 weren't the beginning of this process. They were its culmination. What remains standing after 1812 tells a story the official narrative doesn't want examined. Buildings that survived the fires often show architectural elements that don't match post-fire reconstruction. Structural features that suggest different construction techniques, different proportional systems, different mathematical principles than what was built to replace them. In Moscow, certain buildings in areas that supposedly burned completely show no fire damage, despite being surrounded by structures that were clearly rebuilt after 1812. In London, some warehouse districts contain buildings with architectural features that don't appear in any official records of post-fire reconstruction, as if they were deliberately omitted from redevelopment plans. These survivals suggest selective destruction rather than random catastrophe. Someone was making decisions about what to preserve and what to eliminate. Someone had criteria for determining which architectural elements served the new system, and which represented the old civilization that needed to be erased. The speed of post-1812 urban reconstruction also suggests pre-positioned resources. You don't rebuild entire city districts within a few years without stockpiled materials, trained workers, and detailed plans already in place. The official explanation attributes this rapid development to human determination and ingenuity. But determination doesn't explain where the stone came from, where the skilled craftsmen were trained, or how complex architectural plans were produced so quickly. What if the materials were already quarried and stored? What if the workers were already trained and waiting? What if the plans were already complete, just waiting for the clearing operation to finish? That would explain the remarkable uniformity of post-1812 construction, the mathematical sophistication of new urban layouts, and the coordination of reconstruction projects across vast distances. And it would explain why 1812 marks such a clear break in architectural history. Not gradual evolution, not natural development, but systematic replacement of one building tradition with another. The kind of transformation that requires planning, resources, and coordination on a scale that official history claims didn't exist in 1812. The fires of that year weren't disasters, they were the final act of conquest, the last step in replacing Tartarian civilization with the system we've inherited. What we call the modern world might actually be the remnants of a hostile takeover, a planned transformation disguised as natural historical development. But perhaps the most disturbing evidence isn't what was destroyed in 1812. It is what happened to the survivors. Contemporary accounts from across the affected regions describe refugees, displaced populations, people whose homes and cities had vanished overnight. Yet these populations seem to disappear from historical records almost as quickly as their cities burned. Where did they go? Official histories don't track them, don't document their resettlement, don't explain how thousands of displaced people were absorbed into surrounding communities without leaving traces in census records, tax rolls, or local government documentation. The silence suggests something more systematic than simple neglect of refugee populations. What if the fires weren't just clearing buildings? What if they were clearing people? Not necessarily through direct violence, but through displacement, relocation, forced integration into the new system being installed. The rapid urban reconstruction that followed 1812 would have required massive labor forces. Where did those workers come from? Were they perhaps the same populations whose cities had just burned, now employed in building their replacements according to entirely different architectural principles? The timing of educational reforms across Europe and North America also clusters suspiciously around 1812. New curriculum standards, new textbooks, new approaches to teaching history that emphasize different narratives about the past, almost as if someone recognized that the physical transformation of cities needed to be accompanied by intellectual transformation of the populations that would inhabit them. In Prussia, educational reforms implemented between 1810 and 1815 restructured how children learned about their own history. In France, similar changes occurred during the same period. In the newly formed American states, educational standardization accelerated dramatically after 1812. The coordination suggests planning that transcended national boundaries, as if the same organization orchestrating physical reconstruction was also managing intellectual reconstruction. These educational changes shared common elements that official history attributes to coincidental Enlightenment thinking. But the specificity of what was removed from curricula tells a different story. References to older civilizations were minimized. Geographic knowledge about Central Asian territories was simplified. Technical knowledge about construction and engineering was separated from historical context, taught as modern innovation rather than inherited practice. The institutional coordination required for such comprehensive educational reform suggests the same organizational capabilities that orchestrated the physical destruction. Universities across different empires simultaneously restructured their programs. Libraries reorganized their collections, often discarding materials that didn't align with new historical narratives. Academic publishing consolidated around specific interpretations of recent events, creating consensus through repetition rather than evidence. By 1820, less than a decade after the fires, the educational transformation was complete. Students were learning history that portrayed 1812 as a year of unfortunate but isolated disasters, followed by remarkable human achievement in reconstruction. The systematic nature of the burning, the coordination across continents, the impossible speed of rebuilding, all of these patterns were edited out of official accounts. What is most disturbing is how thoroughly this narrative succeeded. Today, mainstream historians don't question the logistical impossibilities of post-1812 reconstruction. They don't investigate the architectural uniformities that appeared across supposedly independent cultures. They don't examine the demographic mysteries of disappeared populations or the sudden appearance of skilled labor forces. The silence isn't just academic neglect. It is institutional policy. Museums don't display artifacts that contradict the established timeline. Archaeological expeditions don't excavate sites that might reveal pre-1812 construction techniques. Government archives don't declassify documents that reference the organizational capabilities required for coordinated global operations in 1812. This systematic suppression continues today because acknowledging the truth about 1812 would require admitting that modern civilization was installed rather than developed, that our cities were planned rather than evolved, that our educational systems were designed to maintain amnesia about what came before. The implications reach beyond historical curiosity into questions about the legitimacy of current power structures. If the fires of 1812 marked the final conquest of Tartarian civilization, then the governments, institutions, and social systems we've inherited might represent the occupation forces rather than natural human development. The rapid technological advancement that followed 1812 might not prove human ingenuity, but rather the implementation of suppressed knowledge by whoever orchestrated the takeover. The pattern suggests deliberate amnesia, systematic forgetting designed to complement the physical transformation the fires had accomplished. If you are replacing one civilization with another, you need to ensure that the new inhabitants don't remember what came before. Don't ask questions about the origins of their suddenly transformed environment. And if 1812 marked Tartary's last stand, then everything we've been taught about the following centuries needs to be re-examined. Because the rapid technological and social development that characterizes the 19th century might not represent human progress. It might represent the installation of a new system by whoever orchestrated the clearing fires of 1812. The evidence is still there, hidden in architectural survivals, buried in witness accounts, preserved in the suspicious patterns that official history refuses to examine. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. The fires of 1812 changed everything, and we're still living in the world they created.